Hello there, I'm Alister Benn and you're watching Expressive Photography. Welcome to the Canary Islands, and over this video and probably the next one or two videos after that, we're going to be exploring some of the amazing landscapes that exist here in these islands that are just stuck out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, well, not the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, off the coast of West Africa here. It's the middle of April, the weather is superb. We're here with three fabulous clients. Ann Kristin and I are guiding them around the island, which I've been to many times before, and this is our second sunrise.
It's always easy when you get to a location to just photograph what's there, the most obvious thing that stands out to you. And where I was stood at the start of the morning before the sun came up was just overlooking this little rock platform. The waves were coming in periodically and sweeping over the top of the surface here. And, you know, this is a very straightforward photograph. Whether it's a good photograph or not, I think is debatable. It all seems just a little bit ordinary to me. However, I do like the way the water was sweeping over here, and I did love the kind of angularity of the erosion of this surface here. As you know, geometry, luminosity, contrast, atmosphere, and colour are the key ingredients of expressive photography and creative expression, and the relationship between this section, this little island here, and the promontory creates a bit of a curve, and I was very mindful of that in the field, not to allow this stuff to get too linear, to have this and this and this all in a line, because that would become very static. And what I've tried to do is encourage angles into this composition. Of course, as soon as the sun comes up, everything changes. Luminosity becomes far more dominant. The colours become somewhat more rich. And I've actually increased the angles of this relationship, as I discussed in the first image there. And what that's doing is creating a much more dynamic composition. The dynamics are a result of the geometry and the intensity of the colour and the luminosity. So this is a really good example of just how two scenes that are essentially very, very similar can be made to feel very, very different. Now, of course, I wouldn't be Alister Benn if I wasn't going to start isolating things within the frame that I find interesting. And I did look at that foreground and think it was one of the more interesting parts of the frame. The white cliffs themselves, especially once they got the light, were really dynamic. Before they got the light, I found it all a little bit flat and low contrast. So I did spend a bit of the time just focused on the foreground. This one is a nice longer exposure to allow for more atmosphere to come into play. This is a much shorter exposure, only when the water had rushed up onto the surface and was pulling back into the sea there, creating a much more like a waterfall flowing down into the sea. So both of these are 65 by 24, the X-Pan aspect ratio that I'm very fond of in the Fujifilm GFX 100S.
I'm using the 100 to 200 f4 lens here, and this is zoomed in quite a lot. It's not quite 200mm. I just love that, it's the incongruity of the little beach just tucked in amongst all these cliffs there. This is a 30-second exposure at f22. at ISO 200 with a 10-stop ND filter and my circular polarizer. The case Revolution filters, zero color cast, just looking so amazing, and crystal sharp.
As with the first composition there, the impact of when the sun came up and got onto the cliffs, everything changes. So this is two photographs pretty much of the same composition, and when the sun was not up yet and I was photographing into the shadows, which is the top image here, the color palette is very different. The colors are more muted, more subdued. This is browner rather than golden. So everything's a bit more homogeneous. The light is cool. The impact of pre-dawn light is that it's mostly cooler light. And once the sun comes up, it's more directional, there's more intensity to it, and you can just see everything changes. We get more color contrast between the water and the rocks, and this is exactly the same composition, just taken maybe 20 minutes apart. And this is the joy of landscape photography. The landscape is always moving, it's always in flux. And I think that's how we can just continually engage with the landscape. And I think that's one of the things I particularly enjoy, is just to be able to be in the landscape and just engage with it. Once the sun came up, the wider view took on a far greater aesthetic appeal. The way the golden light off the cliffs was reflecting in some of these pools, creating a cool reflection or a warm reflection, whether it was reflecting sky or cliffs. So we have some very nice transitions from golden tones to cooler tones. I've kept this strong angle using the island as a bridge. The brain is very good at creating connections between things, and it will connect that line from the prominent, almost sphinx-like promontory of the headland there through the island and into that foreground. So again, quite an angular composition, just using the diagonals of the beach there, the diagonals of this promontory, and the way everything kind of dips and dives. I like this one. I actually like this one quite a lot. Once we start looking at aspect ratios, we can see how quickly that changes the dynamic of a photograph. Squares are very simple in that we have corner to corner an angle of 45 degrees. And because of this section here passes more or less through the center of the frame, then it feels as if there's a direct connection between that corner and that corner. Likewise, there is also an implied angle that comes from there through there into here, and that is a slightly more shallow angle, which is creating that slightly calmer feel as well. Angles within frames are pretty much the passport to how an image is going to feel.
So it's now nearly 9 o'clock in the morning. I think we got here just back of 7 o'clock. The sunrise wasn't until nearly 7:45. So we've been here since the sun comes up about an hour and 15 minutes, and the sun is coming up really, really fast. We're 28 degrees north of the equator here, very different from the conditions we have back in Scotland at this time of year. And the light changes so fast, blue hour through sunrise, and quite instantly into this quite hot. It's 26 degrees Celsius already, and it's quite early in the morning. So one of the things I love reminding participants on workshops is that there really is no such thing as bad light. It's all in here, it's all in attitude. And it's very easy to start thinking that once the light softens, stops being soft and gentle and glowing, that the photography should stop and we should go and find a Starbucks somewhere. However, we're still here because the light is offering new opportunities that weren't available to us an hour ago. The light is now much more contrasty. There's much more detail in the landscape as the light gets more intense on it. My love affair with the Fujifilm GFX 100S continues, and I remember little things just come to my mind just now, which was back in the 80s. We had a TV show in the UK called Red Dwarf, and they had a computer game called Better Than Life. And I do believe that when I look through the viewfinder of this thing, it's actually better than reality. However, that is true for all cameras. because cameras allow us to see the landscape in a way that our eyes don't. We can compress things. At the scene I have behind me, you can see the headland on the right-hand side has this lovely jagged edge on it, and the promontory behind that has all these lovely textures and ripples in it. And using the 100 to 200 mil lens here, I've got enough focal length to create a slice of that, compress the two layers together, and create something that's really very different from what I'm experiencing here. So I think this is something we should always remember. Cameras don't see the world like humans do, and it allows us a trapdoor, a secret cupboard into a different reality, that as we see the landscape through it, we can create visual relationships that aren't explicit in the landscape, but when we notice them, we can create art, which is what I aim to try and do, I guess, is to find aesthetics in the landscape that inspire and motivate me, and hopefully that other people will see and like also. Not that that's the point, but you know, we do love a little bit of external validation, even if it's just to make somebody else feel good about the landscape or feel good about the environment that they live in. One of the points I want to make is that when we are in a landscape, we are surrounded by stuff. We are always surrounded by, you know, the cliffs and the sea stacks and the way the ocean's interacting with the foreground, and we've got 360 degrees of engagement. And what the camera is essentially asking us to do, or suggesting we do, or giving us the opportunity to do, is actually see bits of the world, to isolate small sections of it. And we can do that obviously by zooming in on this video clip, and all of a sudden we're seeing less of the original landscape. But obviously part of the whole skill and craft of landscape photography is to isolate bits that somehow seem to distill the whole and create something that's somehow better than everything, if that makes a lot of sense. But there are so many wonderful little bits of this landscape that are just worth zooming in on. So one of the things I really like about this scene is we have this very jagged edge down the right hand side, which has all this amazing detail in it. We're standing in an area of pyroclastic flow from a very ancient volcanic eruption. And what's happened is all this ash and pumice has been raining down on this landscape and created these really amazing textures. So the whole area is this sort of compressed pyroclastic flow eruption. So we've got this lovely jagged eroded edge on the right hand side, and then all of these lovely flutings, and then just a simple bit of the ocean and sky on the left hand side. And whether it's necessary or not, I'm not entirely sure, but I do like it. I did originally do some focus stacking between the front and the back, because when I focused on the front, which is probably about 40 feet in front of me, and the bit at the back is maybe 200 feet behind me, in front of me rather. So there is quite a lot of separation and distance between those two things. And I did originally do some focus stacking to make sure that they were sharp. But what I've found is that if I focus on the back, that the front is falling into the focal range, or the depth of field range.
I'm very happy with how this one turned out actually. Using the 200mm lens to compress the promontory on the right to the cliff at the back there, and then using an appropriate focal point so that the sharpness was going to be complete. This is probably my favorite photograph of the entire morning. And again, it's just the power of using a lens to change the way we perceive a landscape. We're using an aspect ratio that our eyes don't naturally crop to. We're using compression of foreground and background and even distant water that is different from how we perceive it. Photography isn't real life. The way we see is not photographic. The way we see is experiential, and we can use the camera to create and force relationships within frames that are not explicit in the landscape. And I think that is one of the huge learning points of how we can use our creativity to explore a world that we don't see, we don't experience. And I think that's a massively important thing. I just had so much fun composing bits of the landscape into these panoramic aspect ratios. This is another image that I really like. It has a kind of, it's almost like the prow of a skeletal ship is coming in from the right hand side. It reminds me somehow to something out of like Pirates of the Caribbean or whatever. It's some kind of ghost ship that's become real. I do like this shadow line that's tucked right into the top right hand corner there, and using the frame edge as the relationship between the content and the frame itself. And I think there's a certain amount of mirroring between that section of how the water meets the promontory or the prow of the ship and this section. There seems to be quite a nice repetition of angles and contrast. And of course, the longer exposure creating a very ethereal ocean. And this is the focus stacked version. This was about 20 frames focus stacked, just to compress everything onto a single plane, and using the geometric border between the brighter foreground and the slightly darker background. And again, you know, this is very abstract and it's quite an unusual photograph. And I definitely feel that the image itself almost transcends the nature of the stuff itself. You know, this is all pyroclastic flow. This was ejected 20 kilometers up into the air by an extremely aggressive eruption, and just the power of that, it just seems unimaginable. And I think somehow, you know, I wanted to kind of conjure up that kind of intensity of the genesis of the creation of this image, or the content itself. You know, all of these tiny little pumice pebbles that are locked up in the dust and the ash, that have just been compressed for hundreds of thousands or millions of years. I kind of like this. It feels kind of organic to me. And then finally, again, we've got this amazing geological form where we have these sort of more molten layers where there's obviously been lava flowing, and then we have these bands of various eruptions. So this is almost like the strata of the eruptions, and again, this feels very organic to me, but wonderfully shaped. I really love the geometry on this one. So what, if anything, have we learned from this video? A middle-aged man rambling about better than life and being out in the landscape and pointing our cameras at things, and geometry and contrast and luminosity and atmosphere. All of these things that become part of my life whenever I am looking with my eyes open. What I hope to have given you here is an insight into, you can go anywhere in the world at any time of day, and your attitude of who you take into the landscape with you, who you pack with your camera bag, is going to determine the relationship you have with that landscape. The light can be variable, the light can be great, it can be poor, it can be exciting, it can be dynamic. You can find interesting things if you have an interesting imagination and if you're interested in them. So hopefully that's what you're going to take away from this video. The photographs are a byproduct of an attitude. The photographs are a byproduct of my experience in the landscape. I don't evaluate them as the purpose for being in the landscape. I'm there to be there. Obviously, I was running a workshop and we were there with 3 really engaged people. And during that time, I was able to point them in the direction of ways that they could change their relationship with where they were, and how they could make photographs in a place that was maybe confusing at some times. Thank you very much for watching. I do hope you appreciate the content that we make for you here on YouTube. If you want to dive deeper into expressive photography, please consider checking out our Expressive Photography Forum. You have a choice of a monthly or an annual subscription, but either of those options comes with a 30-day free trial where you can check it out. I make videos every week for there. We have monthly Zoom sessions, we have monthly themes, we have concepts that we explore as a group, and the group of people who are in there now are just so incredible in their own creativity and the insights they have into the expressive photography concept and moving our photographic art forward. So please consider supporting us and our work by subscribing to the channel and subscribing to the Expressive Photography Forum. But apart from that, that's it for this week. I look forward to coming back next week with some fresh content and maybe exploring something a little bit different. So tune in again then, but bye for now.